Cool. So yeah, thank you. Welcome to my presentation, from theory to practice. So I'm looking at the challenges and opportunities of reducing carbon emissions in highways construction. And hopefully it will change the slide. There we go. So a bit of background on my role at the moment and the road scheme that I'm working on. So this is on the A382 road, which is running from Drumbridge's roundabout down into the town of Newton Abbot. This is quite a major scheme. So it's about a £40 million scheme. But crucially, the difference with this is we are very ambitiously aiming to make this the UK's first carbon negative highway across the whole life cycle of the project. And this is only potentially possible because we have this £3.7 million extra funding from the Department for Transport through a nationwide program called Live Labs 2, which some of you may have heard of. It's a nationwide program to decarbonize local roads. So we are one of 7 local authorities or groups of local authorities that have won this funding. So that's our funding, and this is essentially to sit on top of our main scheme funding in order to cover the extra overcost of innovations that will hopefully reduce our carbon emissions all the way to zero and beyond. So this was a 3-year program that launched in spring last year, so running until spring 2026, and then there's also a 5-year monitoring and evaluation period afterwards. Anyway, you may be asking where I fit in. So I don't have an engineering background. I'm having to learn a lot on the job, and I'm sure my technical know-how falls far short than everyone else on this call. But I'm a geographer actually. I graduated from University of Exeter last year, and I took up this role as carbon reduction officer, specifically within this live lab. So not working on the highways design at all, just simply looking at the innovations and trying to calculate how we can cut carbon, which is easier said than done. So in order to calculate how much carbon we are reducing or aiming to reduce, we first need to calculate our overall carbon footprint. And this is done using industry standard conversion factors for fuel, for materials, everything like that. And we can see at the moment it's about 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent is our carbon baseline. These are the big offenders you can see: general prelim, pavements and earthworks, some drainage, concrete, curbing as well. I think the key thing to note is that this baseline is constantly moving, because as we're designing more elements of the scheme, as we're looking in more detail at where materials come from and slowly building up the picture of all the carbon that's involved with this, we're finding that baseline increase over time. And we're doing this by actually creating our own bespoke carbon calculator with the University of Exeter in order to produce a project A382 carbon calculator, which is building on all previous work done before at Devon County Council. So how do we actually reduce all that carbon? Well, it's through a range of innovations. This is a broad front. We're looking at surfacing, concrete, everything involved with prelim, everything involved with site clearance, street furniture, trying to reuse materials, using electric plant. Basically anything you can think of, we've probably looked at. And I'm not going to talk into any detail about any of these in this presentation, but instead I want to focus more on some of the challenges that I have found since I've now 5.5 months into this job, and a lot of these challenges I didn't quite foresee. So the first challenge is about accelerating the industry. So this is one of the key aims of this live lab, and we've had some great successes in this regard, but it's also been quite a bit of a challenge. For example, often with the companies that we're engaging with, for their own carbon assessments, they're not quite at the level of detail that we need to do our carbon calculations. This is a really ambitious target of carbon negative, and therefore it needs to be very transparent, very verifiable at the end of the process. So we need high levels of detail, and that's not always quite there with the industry at the moment. I will also say that carbon reducing measures obviously are not yet cost effective. If they were, we would all be using them. We've got this extra pool of money in order to trial some expensive options, but it can only go so far. And some promising options we have had to reject simply due to financial reasons. Startups and smaller companies lacking capacity. So it's a great success that we're able to work with a lot of startups and local SMEs, but the nature of being a startup is we don't always know whether they'll have capacity. There's been some great products that have looked really promising for use on the A382, but the company just isn't quite there yet, ready to engage with us on a scheme of this size. Secondly is about carbon calculations. This is the one that hurts my brain the most. In order to calculate how much we're saving, as I said, we need this baseline, but calculating this baseline is far more complex and difficult to measure than I anticipated. I've got a picture of those dominoes there because I hope that evokes what it sometimes feels like it's going on in my head, in that as soon as you ask one question or lead to one calculation, it only leads you to needing to ask another question and do another calculation, and it almost feels like there's an endless step of carbon calculations you need to do to find out a baseline of a scheme of this size. On that note, we're asking questions that have never been asked before. This is a great thing. It's part of the benefits of having this live lab, which literally means a live laboratory for trialing these innovations. But often, if we're asking questions that have never been asked before, the answers also aren't out there. So we're having to find these answers ourselves. For example, soil carbon is one of our main focuses at the moment. We know that we've got a lot of earthworks on the scheme. We know that soil has large carbon stock. We want to know exactly how much carbon is in the soil to start with, how much is going to be disrupted when we disturb that soil, how much is going to be returned when we then place the soil back on scheme. And we're looking at fielding our own soil carbon study in that regard. So there's a lot more complications to finding these answers sometimes, and it takes a lot more time and effort than I anticipated. And then finally, standardizing emissions figures and calculations. I've got the EPD logo there. So if you aren't aware, EPD is an environmental product declaration. A lot of companies are moving towards getting them. They're externally verified, basically gives a really detailed assessment of how much carbon dioxide equivalent, greenhouse gases essentially, are produced at each stage of the manufacturing, of the use and the construction of the product, and then at the end of life of the product. So often we will get EPDs from companies that just have what we call the cradle to gate emissions, which is just how the greenhouse gas impact of manufacturing that product up into the stage of when it's finished in a factory, which is really useful. The problem is we're not often comparing apples with apples. We might have products come back with those cradle to gate emissions. We might also then have products that we want to compare it with come back with a whole life cycle carbon assessment, which is basically a figure for the whole life carbon of that product, which is really useful. We're trying to be carbon negative across the whole life cycle of the project, but it's very hard to compare that with a product that just has cradle to gate emissions, for example. So standardizing these emissions figures and trying to compare products on an even playing field is very difficult. Also, with some areas of our schemes, such as asphalt, the industry is actually moving towards just a standard overall asphalt EPD, which is useful in some regards, but not really for us when we're looking to compare different products, and we don't have that level of detail to go by. Finally, or the final challenge, I should say, is about transparency. So greenwashing is a word that is thrown around a lot these days. We do need to look out for it. We need to make sure that the products that we're looking at are really as good as they may say they are. But also we need to be careful that we aren't subconsciously greenwashing. For example, double counting our carbon savings. We need to make sure that we have very clearly defined and distinct calculations that go into our carbon reduction calculations. Make sure we're not double counting them. NDAs, so non-disclosure agreements. These take a lot of time and effort to get them sorted, and we can't often have discussions about carbon footprints of products without talking about the individual elements that go into the materials that make them. And without them, sometimes we need NDAs, especially with these startups. So it all delays the process. And sometimes just straight up secrecy. Some companies are just not very keen to share their carbon information. Carbon credits is another one of those buzzwords, but carbon credits, I've discovered that I didn't know from my degree, is basically a completely unregulated market. We've had companies sell us what they call a carbon negative product, but only later in the process do we find out that the carbon credit associated with making that product carbon negative is actually kept by the company, and they'll sell that on separately. So in essence, the product that we're getting isn't carbon negative, so we need to be very careful about that. And finally, public perception. So managing our image and expectations. It's important to note that this carbon negative target is just that. It is a target. We have to be transparent with this Live Labs program, but we also are very much allowed to fail. And in doing so, we need to shed light on the lessons learned. And this Live Lab is about asking, why can't it be carbon negative if we can't get there? We'll get as close as we can. Hopefully we'll get there, but if not, it's about finding out what's stopping us. So that maybe future projects can get there. But it's important to manage those expectations so that this project isn't seen as a failure if we don't get there. I'll also note that we are currently on site cutting down vegetation for the clearance that has to commence before we get on site and actually build this road. And that's obviously not a good look. Carbon negative road, environmentally conscious, first thing we're doing down is cutting down quite a large amount of trees which have to be cut down. But so we've had to manage that very carefully from an image point of view. We've brought in a range of innovations to actually transform the way that Devon County Council clears vegetation on schemes of this size. So we're looking at reusing as much of the timber as possible directly on the scheme for street furniture, so fencing, signpost columns, street lighting columns, hopefully, waymaker posts, bollards, all things like that. We're also looking at tree translocation, which I'll get to on the next slide, and also things like biochar. So these innovations are great because they're directly addressing potential area of concern, vegetation clearance, but also we need to be careful with how we talk about them in public because we don't want to look like we're bragging about cutting down trees, obviously, for a project of this nature. So that brings me on to talking about these opportunities and successes. So I mentioned the tree translocation. So that's a photo there taken just last week of some operators on site. What we're doing is building what we call a tree nursery on the other side of the road from where a lot of these trees are being cut down. So normally these trees would be chipped, sent off to biomass plant, probably burnt, but as many of these trees as possible, we're actually hand digging out the earth and we're moving to this tree nursery where they're being replanted. They're going to continue to sequester carbon dioxide over the course of the road's construction, and then they're going to be placed, replanted back at the end of the scheme. And we're seeing that these trees are much larger than any whips, small tree saplings that you would bring in normally to offset your tree cutting regimes. So this is a great success. We're already seeing successful application of innovations on site. There's many more planned. Other successes include collaboration with a range of local authorities and also, so these are local authorities both within the Live Labs program, but also local authorities beyond the Live Labs program, as well as local authorities companies, startups, small SMEs. We're asking the tough questions, and these companies actually, they haven't been put off often by these tough questions, but they've actually encouraged us, and they've been really grateful. And for us asking these questions about, for example, asking them to break down their carbon emissions as finely and in as high resolution as possible. And they've actually really enjoyed that process, and they've learned a lot from it. So we've collaborated with companies on that front. We're also looking to collaborate with academia. For example, on the soil carbon study, we're looking at collaborating with academic institutions on that. And I'll probably finish things up by saying, just by promoting our projects in as many ways and places as possible, we are seeing more and more active discussion on the carbon footprint of road construction schemes, but also crucially on where the carbon can be saved and reduced. So that's a bit of background on this A382 Live Labs 2 project. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Aidan. I think firstly, I am a geographer as well, and someone else posted in the chat saying that geography is a great degree, and I completely agree. So you're not alone. So really interesting, like, topic, carbon reduction, because yeah, it's a very complicated field, as I'm sure you're learning.
Yeah.
So my question was, so hopefully we're moving away from like highways construction across the UK. I think Wales have stopped all road building. Hopefully similar will happen in England in the future. So it's just whether you've looked at anything that can be done in terms of like reducing carbon on existing roads, or whether you've just been exploring like roads that are being constructed at this stage.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, so at the moment, the focus is particularly on this scheme, which I guess, to call it construction, there's an element that is being completely brand new constructed. So there's a new link road that's being built, but a lot of the scheme is, some of the scheme is widening or realigning the road, but then we are also looking a lot at maintenance. So the lessons that we're learning, hopefully from these innovations, looking at maintenance regimes, can be applied to existing roads throughout Devon and beyond. So I would say yes, the main focus is particularly on construction at the moment, but we're hoping that the legacy of this is going to be far more broad than that.
Okay, cool. I look forward to seeing the outcomes once it's all been
Me
done.
too.
Move on to anyone else if they got questions.
Aidan, that's really interesting to see what's going on and how innovative and what these programs can hopefully lead to. My question is, from what you've been looking at, what do you think is the best innovation that has been considered but maybe not included, and why that is, and what's sort of the best one that you're looking at implementing?
Yeah. So yeah, it's important to know. I didn't, not sure if I said, but yeah, we've been asked this a lot, and there is no silver bullet. There is no obvious big game changer, but it's more the best innovations are ones that can be applied across a broad front and can also enable further innovations. So I would say of them, biochar, which I wasn't able to get into that much detail in that presentation, but I can explain a little bit more now. So biochar is essentially looks a bit like charcoal. It's a product of what you get from pyrolysis, which is basically when you burn vegetation matter in an anoxic environment. It doesn't release any carbon dioxide, and the product you get at the end is a very stable store of carbon. So it's very so it's a carbon negative product, but it also can be used we're looking at applying it in concrete, and we're looking at applying it also in asphalt as well. So these are two, and as well as on the landscaping, because it has lots of benefits to the soil as well. So I would say something like that. That's a very expensive option that we've looked at, but has such a wide potential, is really exciting. So we're going to be on site in just a couple of months actually making all of this biochar, and there's going to be heaps and heaps of it. So they better get a use. Otherwise we're going to have a lot on our hands. Was your other question about options that have been promising but we probably haven't been able to pursue?
Yes.
Yeah, so we have all of these options have to be internally approved, and so we've only really recently started the process of putting these options to our internal governance board and presenting them and getting them to vote. There's been one rejection so far based on cost. So this was on direct air capture, which is quite an exciting technology. It was a great option on many fronts. For example, it would be working with a really local company that actually make carbon negative rum, but they would be looking at supplying a direct air capture machine for us on site. It could be moved around throughout the project. It could be taken off site at the end of the project and stuck on a Devon council building, for example. It was really, really, really promising, but for the scale of this scheme and how much carbon dioxide we needed to reduce, it wasn't financially viable. It's great for making their rum, but for helping to reduce 10,000 tons for the cost that it was going to be, it just didn't add up. So it was a shame, but we've had to say no to that.
Okay, nice. Any Neil, you got a question?
Yeah, I have indeed. Aidan, that was very, very interesting indeed. I mean, I'm aware of a project in Scotland that you might have heard of just north of Perth, the Cross Tay Link Road, which has had some publicity where they went to tender and got a contractor who's able to save a lot of carbon and cost, which was a very interesting parallel. But it's a very interesting area you're working in. I'm guessing that the Live Labs brief that you read, the UK's first carbon negative road scheme, I think that's very laudable, but you did mention the perception. That title might, to the general public, imply that there's something special about the vehicles using the roadway as well.
Yeah.
Is there any angle on the traffic management comes into your project brief, or is it purely a construction carbon remit?
Yeah, that's another common question we have, and I probably should have clarified that. Is yes, this is specifically looking at the construction and maintenance of this road. We're not quite at a stage yet. So I mean that's ambitious enough to try and aim for carbon negative on that.
Yeah.
Not quite at a stage to also look at the operation of that road from the users. But I'm sure future Live Labs will. So yeah, I think it's one step at a time.
Agreed. No, that's good. Now, I'll just comment on. I'm with Sarah when she said that the expectation perhaps is that there'll be less new roads built generally in the country, but I'm certainly of the view that there'll be even more maintenance, resilience, redesign, rebuilding of pieces of road that will be damaged by weather events, and that we will always need to construct and have the skills and knowledge to construct low carbon roads. So there's a lot of value in what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that, Neil. I think as well, like cars are getting heavier, so the maintenance is just going to increase and increase. So yeah, be interesting to see where all this goes in the future.